we've taken a look at the first major conflict of the new century, World War I. We've looked at techniques of waging war, the fact that it was a total war, along with the fallout of it. Our goal here is now to look at the economy, so to speak, of the interwar years. And quite frankly, this is the time of the Great Depression. Now, in analyzing it, it's clear that bank failures that occurred across Europe and the United States really revealed how finance and trade had integrated the world into something resembling a single economic system. Now, generally speaking, two factors stand out as leading to the Great Depression. The first would be excessive speculation of the American stock market and the structure of the international debt that emerged after World War I. So the global economy had recovered from the war by the late 1920s, and consumerism is kicked into high gear. Speculators continued to buy stock with borrowed money because they assumed that the markets would endlessly increase in value. When the bubble burst, the investors were ruined, and the bankers who lent them the money were also ruined. Capital investment begins to stall, and a true economic crisis began to emerge. Now, the collapse of the U.S. stock market proved how vulnerable the international financial system was. So this is where we get into the structure of post-war international debt. The U.S. had replaced England as the creditor of the world, so a large number of European governments were deeply indebted to the United States. The Germans were hit especially hard because the recent Weimar government had to take out massive loans to pay reparations to the French. American financiers lent money to the Germans, who paid the French, who in turn sent the money back to the United States so that they could pay their loans back. Once the market crashed, the Americans recalled their loans, which sent the system into a tailspin. And by 1933, German factories were only producing half of what they had in 1929. Now, politicians often made the problem worse. The United States imposed high tariffs to protect American manufacturers, and the British enacted tariff preferences within their empire. These protectionist measures are certainly designed to save jobs, but they often ended up causing a steep decline in international trade and subsequent job loss. Wages and prices dropped in the early 1930s due to this deflationary cycle. So with this so-called Great Depression, this global economic crisis, we begin to look at different responses to the crisis. All right, we begin with various forms of government involvement, mainly Western nations. Times are tough, and few believed that pure free market solutions were in order. The British economist John Maynard Keynes argued that massive unemployment is more than simply a short-term corrective measure, but rather it's a structural problem that stemmed from a lack of demand. Governments needed to spend freely and expand the money supply to help fix the problem. By borrowing money and increasing demand by pumping capital to spend into the economy, governments could pull themselves out of recessions. That's the idea. The ensuing economic revival would provide enough tax revenue to help pay off deficits. And this is a sharp contrast to laissez-faire politicians who thought that the market would correct itself with time and that government should stay out of the economy. All right, so that's Keynesian economics, Keynesian economics. It depends on how you pronounce it. Already used to taking a more active role in economic life during the war, the governments of Britain, France, and the United States took on a more active role in domestic economics, and the U.S. takes the lead, and this is where the New Deal comes into play. Social Security promised a safety net for the nation's elderly. The Works Progress Administration put the unemployed to work on things like public infrastructure, price subsidies assisted farmers, and the government stepped in to protect the accounts of depositors to restore faith in the banking system. Now, this doesn't get to the root of the problem and really is more like a Band-Aid. Unemployment still stood at about 16% in the US at the eve of World War II. Similar initiatives of government intervention are implemented in Britain and France, while the Social Democrats in Sweden, Norway, and Denmark created so-called welfare states and offered comprehensive education, healthcare, and unemployment insurance. Now, the short-term suffering was reduced, but individual national actions simply couldn't solve the global problem brought about by a shortage of credit. This is truly structural. All right, so this is the common refrain of the Great Depression. You look at the New Deal. Globally speaking, it hits millions of peasant farmers in Africa, Asia, and Latin America especially hard. There were a few remote areas where farmers could simply withdraw from the markets and focus on subsistence farming, but the globe had become so economically interconnected by 1930 that this is just not a possibility. You look at family farmers in Africa. They grow cash crops like coffee, cotton, and cocoa to buy imported goods like cloth and kerosene lamps. And the profits are also used to pay the taxes that European colonial governments demanded. Coffee and cocoa prices fell by over half by the early 1930s. So many Africans were unable to pay their taxes or pay off their debts. Since Western manufacturing had been displacing local industries, and locals were dependent on imported goods, they could no longer afford to purchase them. School attendance is also going to decline because children are forced to leave their villages in search of work to help out their families. In Egypt, cotton prices plunged because European and US textile factories cut production. All right, so in addition to hurting small farmers who produce cash crops, the economic downturn is going to hurt plantations where export commodities are produced. Brazil was the world's largest producer of coffee, but they suffered when European and North American customers, who do consider it a luxury, scaled back on these purchases. Exporters responded by burning tens of thousands of tons of coffee and shoveling it into the sea, which is what you see in the image. They hoped that decreasing the supply would increase prices. Agricultural workers left their plantations and they often ended up in the urban slums. And a similar situation played out in Southeast Asia when global demand for rubber and bicycles caused those prices to crash. The drop in cotton prices affected Indian farmers who were already being squeezed by high taxes. So many families responded by selling the gold jewelry they were saving for their daughters' dowries. Billions of rupees worth of gold was sold, and many either delayed or canceled marriage. They just simply delayed it. This also caused many South Asian families to cancel their pilgrimages to Mecca. Now, a similar situation occurs in Egypt. About 16,000 per year made the journey prior to 1929. Only 1,700 made that same journey by 1933. Now, economic nationalism was a common Latin American response. And we've already seen in Mexico that they're on the road to this. The Mexican president nationalized the petroleum industry, and he reasoned that the profits should have helped the Mexican people as opposed to foreign businesses. Land is redistributed to rural Mexican peasants, finally fulfilling that promise of the Mexican Revolution. And many industries in Latin America are still nationalized to this day, and they went much further than the US example. So we're starting to see in what might have been called third world countries how the Great Depression is affecting their way of life. We've seen Western responses, and now it's time for authoritarian responses. Fascism comes from the Latin term fasces, which ultimately means a bundle of rods tied together for strength. And it plays on this concept that liberal democracy is an obsolete idea, and that one all-encompassing government should control the state. Mussolini in Italy, who you see on the screen, and Hitler in Germany are the two prime examples, and they thought representative democracy was stupid, and that weak and vain politicians only made problems worse. These competing politicians needed to be replaced by strong leaders who would act in the best interests of the people, and then national greatness could be achieved. Individual rights were secondary to unification of purpose and the role of the state played in organizing the collective will. Fascism took nationalism to the extreme, and as was the case with Germany, we'll see that fascism imposed racial policies at extreme levels. So we have fascism and we have communism. They also believed that liberal democracy was foolish, and they followed Marx's ideas that such a government was simply a tool used to manage the affairs of the rich and privileged. While fascists focused on national unity, the communists downplayed this in favor of class solidarity. Despite believing that workers across the world were going to unite at any point and overthrow their oppressors, the Soviet Union was still the only communist state in the 1930s. Stalin instituted the first 5-year plans in 1928, wherein he removed peasants from their villages at gunpoint to collectivize farms and the land. And the Red Army was sent in to remove any resistance. Non-Russian parts of the Soviet Union were treated as colonies, whose raw materials were used to allow for Russian industrial growth. They did skip the unemployment aspect of the Great Depression, so the Soviet Union didn't suffer like everyone else. But wages were kept low to allow for increased industrial investment. The gulags helped increase productivity. Now, there weren't many details known about this process, so the statistics showed the outside world that communism appeared to be working. And even the image you see is a propaganda poster showing peasants who seem to want collectivization, but the truth was much worse. So the authoritarian responses will help lay the groundwork for World War II.